Hi guys, Shawn here from DigiDirect. Today we're going to be talking about an outstanding lens, and that's the brand new Sigma 50 to 100mm f1.8 Art Series lens. So this is going to be a fairly short review because all I have to say is positive things about the lens. This won't come as too much of a surprise to you if you're familiar with any of the other Sigma Art Series lenses. Sigma started releasing these lenses in the last 4 years or so, and they've been universally some of the best reviewed lenses of the last couple years. Just, straight A's across the board from this lens series. The 50 to 100mm is no exception. It is a bit of a departure in that it's a fairly longer zoom lens. On the longer end, a lot of the Art Series lenses tend to be a little bit wider. So this is a good entry in an area that they haven't really covered yet. 50 to 100mm is a pretty decent range. That's going to cover your starting to get to your portrait length, focal length, and then into a little bit beyond that as well. I should mention this is an APS-C compatible lens only, so it's only going to work on APS-C or crop sensor cameras. Now that's going to be like your Canon 7D, 80D, 700D, or your Nikon D7200, 7100, D5500, those kinds of cameras. It's not going to work on a full frame camera like a Canon 5D, 6D, a Nikon D810, and so on. It's also available in Canon and Nikon mount. Now, if you want to talk about the focal length in terms of full frame equivalent, because it is an APS-C lens, a crop sensor lens, in full frame equivalent terms, this would be an equivalent to a 75 to 150mm lens. So getting close to the classic 70 to 200 length. Obviously doesn't go all the way into 200mm equivalents, but pretty close. Okay, but let's touch on what I think is kind of the most exciting aspect of this lens right off the bat, and that's the aperture. So it has a maximum aperture of 1.8, and this is like a really huge deal. Traditionally, an aperture of 1.8 is really something you can only achieve on a prime. You don't see that on zooms. Zooms traditionally have had only a maximum aperture of 2.8. Now there's only one lens other than this one that I can think of that breaks that rule, and that's one of the first lenses that Sigma released in their Art Series lineup, which is the very popular 18 to 35 1.8. So this is the second time Sigma's done that and given us a zoom lens with a 1.8 aperture. What this means is that this lens is going to be excellent in low light. 1.8 aperture means it lets in a ton of light, so if you're doing any kind of indoor shooting, nighttime shooting, any situation where you don't have a lot of light, a 1.8 aperture is going to let you let in as much light as possible and go a long way to helping your photos still look good in low light. I should also mention that it's a 1.8 aperture all the way through the zoom range. It doesn't get any darker. It's 1.8 at 50mm, 1.8 at 100mm, everywhere in between. The other place where the 1.8 aperture is going to be beneficial is in achieving shallow depth of field. So if you're not exactly sure what that is, think of a portrait that you've seen that looks nice. Typically, the subject, the person in the portrait, is in focus and the background is all blurred out. It's kind of a nice stylistic look, very popular these days. That's something that is easier to achieve with a wider aperture. So again, that's something that's going to be very easy to achieve with this lens. Also, the fact that this lens is 50 to 100, it's a bit of a longer focal length. That shallow depth of field effect is exaggerated by a longer focal length. So compared to, let's say, the 18 to 35 1.8, the 50 to 100 will give you even more shallow depth of field because it's a longer focal length, even though it's the same aperture. So if you're looking to do any kind of low light or shallow depth of field portraiture work, it's really going to do a good job there. In video shooting, a shallow depth of field, typically makes movies look a little bit more cinematic. Not always, but it's usually a very desired trait to be able to achieve. Next, let's check out the build quality of the lens. Again, very similar to the other lenses in the Art Series lineup, similar kind of look. It is very large compared to the other Art Series lenses. This is the biggest lens in the Art Series lineup. So do bear that in mind. It's not a tiny, small, light lens. That's the one thing that you might want to bear in mind when thinking about this lens. But it is built like a tank. It's metal. You've got a very large, very well-damped focus ring at the front, and a nice, again, well-damped zoom ring in the middle. You've got a large focus distance meter readout in between the rings there, and that's going to tell you what is in focus based on how many meters or feet away from the front of the lens it is. You also have an autofocus and manual focus toggle switch. They've also added a little tripod foot here. That's again taking into account the weight of the lens. If you're putting it on a tripod, you'll probably want to mount it on the tripod foot rather than on the camera, so it's not too front heavy on your tripod. And that tripod foot is adjustable. You can change it to a couple different positions around the lens. I should also mention that the lens is completely internally zooming and internally focusing. When you zoom or focus, the front element does not move at all. It doesn't extend, it doesn't rotate. It's all internal. The last aspect I'll touch on is the sharpness of the lens. Again, no surprises here. The 50 to 100 millimeter is a super sharp lens, like all of the other Art Series lenses from Sigma. It's sharp wide open at 1.8, it's sharp at 50, it's sharp at 100, it's sharp in between. It's sharp across the whole frame. There's really not much more to say than that. It's a tack sharp lens, wide open at any of the available focal lengths. So you're going to definitely have excellent picture quality, excellent video quality coming out of the 50 to 100 millimeter. Now, one other thing that I should mention is that the 50 to 100 millimeter is basically a parfocal lens. Now, this is going to be of interest to video shooters primarily. A parfocal lens is a lens where as you zoom it in or out, the focus point does not change. So if I focus on something when I'm at 50 millimeters with this lens, and then I zoom it into 100 millimeters, that focus point stays the same. Now, some lenses, when you zoom them in, the focus point changes and you have to readjust focus after you zoom in or out, which means, an extra little bit of work to keep it in focus. Especially in video, you typically don't want that, but the 50 to 100 millimeter is, practically speaking, pretty much parfocal, so that's going to be very useful for video shooting. So that's about all there is to say about the 50 to 100 millimeter. Just a class act all the way through. Like I said, exactly what would we expect from any of Sigma's Art Series lineup at this point. Superior build quality, a blazing fast aperture, especially for a zoom lens, an almost unheard of fast aperture, rivaled only by one of Sigma's other lenses, the 18 to 35. And super sharp all the way across the frame and wide open. So really not a lot that you can go wrong with this lens. If you're looking for a lens within this focal range, definitely give this lens a hard look because it will not disappoint you in its performance and quality. If you'd like to give it a test and try it out, come into one of our stores. We've got stores in the Sydney CBD, Bondi Junction, Miranda, the Melbourne CBD, and the Brisbane CBD. You can also get the 50 to 100 millimeter on our website at www.digidirect.com.au. Take care.